So, good morning, everyone. I am Maria Kokori, Research Fellow in Conservation Science, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to Jim Coddington's lecture. The lecture is part of the Modern Contemporary Materialities series organized by Jill Bugalski, Francesca Casadio, and myself. And before I introduce the speaker, I'm just going to say a few words to introduce the event. From May 2017 to the summer of 2018, the Art Institute will host 4 lectures paired with scholars' workshop discussions on specific topics that impact our understanding of modern and contemporary materialities today. The series will culminate in an object-based Art History Scholars' Day in June 2018 that will draw together the various threads of discussion that advance over the course of the year. The event considers some of the broad issues and ideas associated with the concepts of materiality and immateriality, and it aims to provide the opportunity to engage much broader section of the visual profession into dialogue, most crucially, curators, art historians, conservators, and scientists. A work of art to be material is a question of complex trajectories. If one wants to be complicit with material, it's not nowadays enough simply to point to the fact that some objects are made out of pigments, oils, wood or stone, and how we react to them. The point is to understand the history of the materials used, to research other contexts in which they were applied, to follow the traces of materials. Focusing on the moments when materials leave behind the confines of studio art, become willful actors and agents within artistic processes and interact with audience in a network of connections, this series of lectures aims to map and explore the substances that artists have engaged with to expand notions of process, time, space, form, structure, or participation. This cross-disciplinary dialogue addresses questions such as, can materiality foster a new method for thinking about art? And what is its place in art history studies? What does it mean to give agency to the material, to follow the material, and perhaps act with the material? What models do material studies have to offer that could address ontological issues while also engaging with questions of aesthetics, politics, or social history? These are among many other questions that could increase rather than reduce the complexity of the topic, but I hope that this series is going to stimulate plenty of thought-provoking discussion. This is not the first event to deal with materiality in modern and contemporary art, and it's not likely to be the last. And it's also not the first time that scientists and conservators have met with curators and art historians to discuss some of these topics. But we hope that the format of these events, consisted of very focused discussions, will foster the kind of dialogue that would move the curatorial, conservation, and art historian fields forward. It is a great pleasure to introduce Jim Coddington. Jim recently retired as Agnes Gant Chief Conservator from the Museum of Modern Art in New York after 30 years at the museum. He collaborated on many restorations, exhibitions, and research projects during his tenure there, and contributed to numerous joint publications with conservators, curators, and scientists that have been ranged from studies of Jackson Pollock, de Kooning, Miro, and artists and other artists to studies of new imaging technologies and their application within the conservation field. Jill Bugalski, Francesca Casadio, and I would like to specially thank the Stockman Family Foundation for generally supporting the Modern Contemporary Materialities lecture series, Ann Goldstein, Sarah Guernsey, Frank Giucari, and the Audrey W. Mellon Foundation. Thanks are also due to many colleagues who provided support and encouragement, Jan Trujillo for her support in the organization of the event, and Nick Young for audio and visual support. So again, my thanks to Jim and to all of you for attending what we hope to be an important and enjoyable event. And without further delay, I would like to welcome Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this series. But in particular, I want to thank you for inviting me at this particular moment, because it gives me an opportunity to give my thanks and admiration to one of your colleagues, Frank Zuccari. Frank is one of those conservators who has led by example, and I have always been grateful for that. And I just simply add my voice to the chorus when I say, salute, Frank. So, I'm going to start this lecture maybe a little bit in an unorthodox fashion. Title of that video is The Way Things Go by Peter Fishley and David Weiss, made in 1987 and recorded on 16mm video. The Way Things Go is a gravity-defying riot of pyrotechnics, anticipation, potential energy turned into kinetic energy, or more to the point, as I think you've already indicated, fun. This work is full of themes that modern art has engaged, sliding literally back and forth between allusions to sex, violent ends, a delicate balance between order and chaos, all with these artists' humor of unseemly sounds of gas escaping and water dribbling, competing with the ironic humor of Swiss artists carefully constructing destruction, defying their national image of lasting quality and yet so carefully building each of these devices like little Swiss watches, and so on. They pay homage to some of the great masters of modern art, Duchamp's sly humor and seeming use of chance events, Pollock's controlled splatters and drive to make energy visible, Rauschenberg's tire stuffed with an Angora goat, and perhaps more than anyone, Hitchcock's mastery of suspense and the MacGuffin. While this is not a painting, and Fishley and Weiss have rarely turned to painting, the video still shows an acute sense of the art that has gone before them, the traditions from which they emerged, and the conflagrations that occasionally occur within those traditions, ones that I will argue Joan Miro sought to ignite. That artists consciously operate and create within the traditions of their medium is seemingly self-evident. Indeed, it is necessary to the explication of many of art history's narratives. Artist A begat artist B, ism B followed ism A, and so on. At times, however, artists will explicitly work in opposition to those traditions, or at least to radically expand what tradition encompasses. One sturdy tradition within the history of Western art is that of announcing the demise of painting. On the Iberian Peninsula, Miro's peninsula, this goes back at least as far as Pacheco, who wrote, and I quote, "I have been told by men who knew Michelangelo well that this blessed master wept, seeing that the tempera manner was dropped and that painting in oil was embraced by all. He said, indeed, painting is over and finished," unquote. It is significant that Michelangelo locates the death of painting in the choice of materials as much as or more than in the activity or subject matter of painting itself. In the 20th century, the explicit effort to radically transform or even bring painting to an end became a point of considerable debate, theory, and for some, practice. Few artists were as vocal in their effort to overturn the order of painting than the Surrealists. The Surrealists, led by André Breton and others, argued for a more conscious effort to bring painting to an end. In 1927, Joan Miro publicly joined this tradition with statements to Maurice Reynaud and others that he wished to, quote, assassinate painting, a proclamation every bit as violent as Fishley and Weiss's pyrotechnics, but one sense is far more serious in its goal. The use of the word assassinate in 1927 would be as loaded as it could be, coming barely a decade after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand led Europe into a spiral of horrific violence that destabilized the existing political order. Thus, although Miro may well have been engaging in more full-throated surrealistic rhetoric in an effort to destabilize the existing artistic order, he was doubling down on the stakes by his use of this particular word. This lecture will examine Miro's works in the decade after that challenge in an attempt to untangle what Miro understood the tradition of painting and the act of painting to be, and how these works represent his assassination of painting. So what was this assassin, shown here in 1935, almost a decade into his effort, planning to do when he assassinated painting? Or more precisely, what did Miro do in that attempt? One approach to understanding what Miro may have meant by painting, or to use his words, anti-painting, is to take the cue from Michelangelo and examine his materials and techniques during this period and how they were informed by, as well as chosen in opposition to, conventional painting practice of the time and longer-standing painting traditions. Resistance to established academic painting from the mid-19th century on is well documented. By the time Miro embarked on his overt revolt, others, Picasso, Braque, and Schwitters, had begun to push the boundaries of what materials of painting might include, as well as how to incorporate them into the work of art. Miro pressed these boundaries hard during this decade, using both the most prosaic materials and some of the most advanced synthetic resins of his time. Yet he also looked to materials steeped in tradition, like copper as a painting support and pastel for drawing, thus offering a complex dialogue between unique innovation and traditional materials. During this decade, he often returned to a material only to use it differently or to rearrange its relationship to other materials in an ongoing internal negotiation about painting, and its unique importance to him. As he told Michel Leiris in 1929, quote, "I often change the way I paint, looking for means of expression. Always I am guided by this burning passion which makes me walk from left to right," unquote. Miraut's retrospective accounts of his early artistic education suggest that he was bound up in this dialectic of resistance and innovation, consciously or not, from his earliest days in art school. According to Jacques Dupin, author of the Catalogue raisonné of Miraut's work, his first training from 1907 to 1910 was at La Loja here in Barcelona, where the emphasis was on craftsmanship, while later, from 1912 to 1915, he attended Francesco Galli's school, where he deeply absorbed Galli's stress on the importance of the imagination. Beginning in 1928 and 29, with his first published interviews and statements, Miraut recalled Galli's critical lessons about tapping into the creative spirit as being vital to his artistic development, but his references to specific procedures and materials are not yet published to my knowledge. Close examination of the objects themselves thus provides the primary evidence and insight into the materials the artist used and how he used them in his attempt to destroy painting. The most straightforward way to do that is to adopt the classical structure of paintings and to work our way through the material structure of secondary support, stretcher, support, canvas or panel, or any number of other materials that might be used by Miraut, ground, other preparation layers, the design layers, paint, pastel, whatever you might be choosing, and any coatings, varnish, etc. In 1927, so we get to Miraut's work finally. In 1927, Miraut painted a series of works on bare canvas in which he explored the possibilities of making evident its varied textures and color, featuring the canvas itself and its inherent properties as a central part of the work's compositions. This exploiting of the raw material of his support, whether canvas or something else, was a strategy that he would return to time and again throughout this decade. In painting, illustrated here, and other works from 1927, he utilized the warm tone of the unprimed canvas as the background color, in fact, the major color of the composition. Other artists, most notably Paul Cézanne, had left areas of primed canvas unpainted, but Miraut's strategy of allowing the bare canvas to contribute to the composition and tone of the painting was a fundamentally different choice from that. In several of these works, Head on the right and Painting on the left, are examples of this. A glancing light on the surface shows uneven, seemingly random glossier passages where the sizing has been more heavily applied, where the artist directly manipulated the texture, or more precisely, the perceived texture of the canvas with the sizing. One can also see in these two canvases a ghostly image of the stretcher bars beneath the stretched canvas. I trust you all can see that? Am I making it? Yeah, around the edges. Miraut was very aware of the way stretcher bars could subtly impose themselves on the painted surface, and this was noted by Carolyn Lanchner in her essay for her Miraut exhibition at MoMA in 1993, an essay that I'm deeply indebted to in every way. Carolyn points to Miraut's incorporation of imprinted stretcher bar marks in two paintings from 1925, Personage and Head of a Catalan Peasant, indicating that Miraut was even then thinking about how a painting comes about as the result of painting. Miraut further undermines the received hierarchy of painting materials in painting, as he, that's going to get confusing. The title of this work is Painting. As he applied a patch of gesso being a preparatory layer in classical painting construction, in the upper right-hand corner, and then singled it out by painting a black line around it, as if it were a picture within a picture. By the rules of academic painting, this internal picture is just as incomplete as the larger bare canvas picture, as it is merely a section of ground on canvas, an area ready for the real painting to start. But by drawing stark attention to the passage and making it a picture itself, Miraut demonstrates that he knows gesso is expected to cover the canvas entirely and that he has explicitly chosen not to. In painting Head, gesso has an even more direct role. It takes the form of a head onto which Miro has applied black paint as a pair of dashed lines and a central dot. Gesso is now the principal design element. In his next series of paintings, the Dutch interiors and imaginary portraits executed in 1928 and 1929, the texture of the canvas remains of interest to him. Most notably in Potato, illustrated here, where slubs and other coarse features in the detail on the right are left readily evident beneath an overall composition of paint. Early in 1928, he had made a quite different series of works, ones where he turned to found materials that he then attached to a range of supports. Spanish Dancer is a fecund exercise in tying construction and collage to painterly thinking. That he was thinking of painting in this work is best seen in its compositional similarity to Potato. The painted head here is now sandpaper with a slash of paint on it. The painted line encircling the figure is simply string attached to the paper. I think Miro is also thinking about the picture plane itself, presciently anticipating a debate several decades later when painting once again was reinvented. Spanish Dancer was illustrated in Aragon's La Peinture au défi from 1930 rather differently from the way we see it today. The nail is in fact hanging free, pointing straight down. It's hanging free, not nailed into the support. This unmistakable phallus, centered on a drafting triangle, itself unmistakably read as female genitalia, amplifies Miro's association of worldly desire with worldly materials, rather than the materials of the fine arts. As a conservator, I look at that hanging nail and wonder, amongst these other things, how does one safely transport such a thing without excessive intervention? In essence, how does one overcome the force of gravity? The gravitational pull on the nail also addresses the viewer, who is, like the nail, held in place by gravity, emphasizing the two planes of viewer and work of art. Yet counter to this, the casually placed string remains unnaturally in plane, defiant of gravity, unless the viewer allows herself to think she is now looking down on the picture. Leo Steinbeck's flatbed picture plane, in Other Criteria, argues persuasively, and published a number of decades later, argues persuasively that flatness is a radical departure in painting practice. It is a flatness that is, in one of his formulations, quote, "It is no more of a problem than the flatness of a disordered desk or unswept floor," unquote. An unswept floor, not unlike that string there, and surely finds the germ of itself in this picture too. Miro also looks to the future with Portrait of a Spanish Dancer, a more ethereal composition from 1928. On the back of the panel of this work is an inscription that identifies the paint as Ripplein, a relatively new synthetic paint that we know other artists like Picasso had used as well. Thus, we see Miro testing the boundaries of what one can make a work of art with. On the one hand, using commonplace found materials, cork, pin, feather, and on the other, recently developed synthetic paints. We have touched on the Dutch interiors and imaginary portraits briefly. In these paintings, Miro, for the most part, worked in fairly traditional ways. Indeed, I used them here as a means to illustrate that he was conversant with traditional painting techniques and materials, in this case, drawing. Drawing had been used for centuries as a preliminary step in painting, a means by which artists could finalize a composition before picking up a brush. For these works, Miro not only looked back over art history for his subject, using a painting by John Constable for Mistress Mills, illustrated on the right, and a painting by Jan Steen for Dutch Interior on the left, but he also adopted the gridded transfer drawing, a technique that ensured the exact transfer of a composition from drawing to canvas. In this centuries-old process, an evenly spaced grid was laid onto a drawing, and then an identical matrix of rows and columns was drawn on the canvas, and the drawing replicated box by box so that each form occupied the same relative space within the enlarged matrix. The grid on the canvas of Dutch Interior can be seen clearly with an infrared camera, as can the drawn outlines of many of the forms, showing that Miro transferred the drawing as well as the grid. Might be a little hard for you all to see, but it's the most evident lines in this reproduction I think you can see here and a few up around there. it is there, the grid. In Portrait of Mistress Mills in 1750, one of the imaginary portraits, we have the gridded drawing itself, and the correspondence between the two images, I think, is quite clear. The infrared image of the painting, of which I unfortunately do not have a copy, shows that he used two slightly offset grid patterns on the canvas, and the pair is evident in the final preparatory drawing as well, although one set of lines is fainter than the other. So, of course, you have the principal lines here, but then you see this sort of suite of secondary, slightly fainter lines. Murrow's methodical transfer of both sets of lines is puzzling, when only one would have sufficed. But perhaps this can be read as a sly jab at formulaic approaches to art, much like those he found so lacking in his early training at La Loggia. Moving on to 1930, we see Murrow keeping his ground in plain sight. To the white paint of painting, illustrated here, Murrow also added, as he had done on his bare canvases in 1927, a passage of white gesso and/or plaster in the upper left corner. In this case, however, he utilized the material's stiffness and body to create a highly textured passage, one very similar to impastoed or thickly applied paint, once again expanding and rearranging the possibilities of gesso in relation to the other materials of painting and pushing the humble ground toward more painterly purposes. He further argues for its painterly qualities, and here I pause just to ponder the question of, in a lecture titled Painting, Noun, and Verb, do materials have painterly qualities? But he argues for such painterly qualities with its striking resemblance to the drawn and painted passage just above it to the right. Similarity between those. Also noticeable on this painting are splotches of a warm tone. While they generally follow the composition, they are almost certainly applications of a fixative to the charcoal lines they cover, a fixative that has since quite evidently discolored. So in this instance, even though we have Murrow applying paint to a large canvas, indeed this series is far and away the largest of the decade, he's not varnishing it at all, yet applies a coating as needed for local concerns, the charcoal. We will return to Murrow's use of fixatives, for here too he finds a way later on to transgress against the normal practices of fixing pastels. In 1931, Murrow abandoned making art that has much resemblance at all to painting, instead making sculptures of seemingly randomly found objects that he nailed, stapled, and glued together. An example is Object, illustrated here, where he has taken a rough-hewn fragment of wood, painted on it, applied a touch of sand, and then attached it with a wire to the wire mesh background. Yet an object we, or at least I, can discern in the mesh, can discern the mesh as a direct reference to painting. It could be a stand-in for the woven canvas, or possibly the transfer grid he had used just a couple of years earlier. In the first case, one is led to think not just how random each of these components in Object is, but then how random the components of a painting perhaps are. Such a proposition is indeed fundamentally destabilizing, arguing that the material premise, the underlying support of an art form, painting, is arbitrary. Thus, here too, Murrow may well be continuing his assault on painting. Murrow's continued assault would clearly have to come to terms with how he might use paint itself to achieve something different from traditional paintings. In the so-called Collage Paintings of 1933, we see him touch on this. Murrow's initial step in creating this series was to paste images of tools and machines onto a paper to lay in the basic compositional forms. In the painted composition, he once again returned to canvas, applying thin washes of color to the fairly fine weave of painting illustrated here, leaving its texture readily evident, if not as evident as in the bare canvas paintings of 1928. However, he then added forms in a somewhat thicker and glossier oil paint, so that these forms would float, dematerialize, as it were, further above the washy background. Such a painting strategy of contrasting matte and glossy passages of paint to create a sense of space on the picture plane was, of course, familiar by 1933, one that Cubists had used regularly. Yet here, Miro is also using this difference in gloss to identify that these forms derive from something else, the pasted collage elements he used in the studies for these paintings. Miro thus levels the importance of each of the material he uses. In this case, the paint is meant to represent, not transform and elevate its subject. Paint has the same value, not more, as the cutout forms. Miro was not exclusively painting over the course of this decade, and many of his works on paper reveal an interest in both directly and subtly exploring the texture and color of the support, much as he had done with his painted work on canvas. Perhaps the most distinctive paper support he used in this period was flocked paper, a custom sheet available from local artisans that was prepared by blowing a cloud of fibrous material, varying in color and fineness, onto paper prepared with a coating of glue or paint. The fibers of the paper are thus quite stiff, resulting in a toothy surface that makes the paper particularly well suited to friable media such as charcoal and pastel. Miro's exploitation of the texture inherent in materials as a means to make a composition is fully realized in a work we have already seen, Spanish Dancer from 1928, which features blue-gray flocked paper as a base of the composition. To this, Miro added, as we've noted before, a cutout piece of sandpaper, a considerably coarser material, as well as an illusionistically coarse piece of linoleum, the dots of which suggest a pebbled surface. It's up here in the upper left corner. Miro explicitly contrasts the different texture of the sandpaper and the flocked paper by applying a dry paint to the former and chalk to the latter. The former holds its medium in a firm, stolid shape, and on the latter it blurs and blends into the flocking fibers. It was pastel that Miro principally used on these flocked fibers, as it is a medium that is quite logically used with these toothy supports. In the application of pastel in these works from 1934, Miro becomes notably painterly, blending the color on the paper in sharp contrast to his application of discrete, unmixed colors within forms in painted works, such as the 1933 Collage Paintings and the Dutch interiors. Indeed, in a letter to Pierre Matisse, his dealer, Miro referred to his 1934 pastels on paper as, quote, very painted, unquote. In this letter, he described this series as, quote, based on reality, and indeed his blending of color yields rare instances of a figural shading and lifelike rendering of volume, for example, woman, the opera singer on the left, and figure on the right. Miro also noted in the letter to Matisse that these works were, again I quote, very fixed, unquote, presumably to assuage any concerns Matisse might have about a notoriously fragile medium surviving a transatlantic trip. The phrase also indicates the artist's familiarity with traditional technique, the application of fixative for keeping the friable pastel in place. Examination of several of these works indicates he did indeed fix at least some of them. The light sparkle of sprayed fixative is visible under oblique lighting and magnification, yet instead of shellac, a more common fixative, Miro used cellulose nitrate, a comparatively rare fixative. And I'd like to thank Chris McGlinchey at MoMA and Kim Muir and Gwenelle Gaultier here at the Art Institute for providing me with this data. This material was the original binding medium in enamel paints like Ripplein, which we have seen Miro also use, but cellulose nitrate was also used as an unpigmented lacquer and would thus be a plausible fixative. It is hard to say why Miro made this choice, what properties cellulose nitrate possessed that might have served his purposes better than shellac, but in any case, we see him once again tweaking the formula, readjusting common expectations of how to construct a work of art, once again walking from left to right, as he said. While Miro regarded these pastels as painterly, he was still up to mischief with his use of pencil on these works. One can see traces of pencil on some of these works, drawing done in preparation for the pastel. Far more evident are final pencil marks in the 1934 pastels rather than first preparatory ones, as would be expected, once again showing him finding a way to alter, albeit quite subtly, the role of a traditional material in the making of a work of art. In Woman, the opera singer, this detail, illustrated on the right here, shows the pencil outlines pushing through the pastel, providing firm evidence that they were applied afterward. And that would be along here and here at the edges of the forms. And on figure, The final details of the figures, such as the figure's mouth and eye and diminutive breast, here, are similarly rendered in pencil that carves through the pastel. Earlier, in 1927, Miro had also inverted the normal order of events in painting head, in which he placed a fine pencil profile of a head. And that's going to be, I think, maybe a little hard to see, but it runs roughly along here. A fine pencil profile of a head very precisely between dotted black lines that intersect in a large passage of white gesso. Once again, leaving drawing, or at a minimum the material of drawing, for the last, or one of the last marks on canvas. Moving on to 1935-36, he painted a series of works on copper panel. Copper as a support has a long history and was typically used for highly detailed cabinet-type works from at least as far back as the 16th century. And Miro painted the works in the series in a similar fashion, with fine, careful brushwork throughout. A copper plate requires very specific preparation for painting. The surface must be cleaned, and then tooth for the paint must be created by scoring the surface and or applying a ground similar to that used for canvas. So in these paintings, we see Miro operating very much within the confines of tradition. Again, to my way of thinking, underlying his understanding of convention, and thus making it all the more certain that when he was consciously disregarding convention, he was doing so as part of his mission to assassinate painting. In the same series, Miro also painted on masonite, a solid support invented in 1924. Masonite is produced with a smooth side and a textured side, attributes Miro would utilize in his works at different times. In the masonite works from 1935 to 36, he applied a white gesso to the smooth side of the masonite, covering the board as he did the copper. And he painted them with the same kind of precise brushwork, although instead of oil paint, he used tempera. Miro's choice of tempera, another very traditional medium for his paintings on masonite, provided another opportunity for him to press against the proper use of a revered medium, egg tempera, indeed the very medium that Michelangelo mourned the loss of. Tempera is a fast-drying medium, generally painted on with a fine brush and thin, repeated applications. Miro was well aware of the exacting nature of tempera, which he noted in 1921 in a letter, saying that it required, quote, skill and love of technique, unquote. And indeed, these works were executed with a most punctilious brush. The paint, which dries fairly quickly, does not last long and thus must be made fresh daily, and therefore would almost certainly have been made by the artist himself, by his taking dried pigments and mixing them into the egg-based medium. It is not uncommon during this laborious process for pigment to clump at the outset, requiring more mixing to create the smooth, easily flowing texture that is characteristic of tempera. This intermediate moment in the making of paint seems to have captured Miro's imagination, piquing his fascination with surface and texture. In the upper left area of Figures and Bird, which was illustrated in the prior slide, coarse particles of pigment pepper the sky as if painted with crudely mixed tempera or with chunks of pigment added to the mixed medium. Thus, Miro used a core constituent of the pigment not only as color, but as texture, in much the same way that he previously used sand and other materials that leveled the difference between the materials of fine art and everyday experience. But by doing this with paint, he's also declaring the paint as base as any of these other materials he used. He also underlined this breakdown of the expected order of things thematically, placing the tangible earthly pigment in the sky. I would now like to slightly step out of this chronological presentation and look closely at a work from Miro's auto revision series done earlier in 1935 than the works on copper and masonite. Well, in many of the works discussed, we see his use of traditional materials as at times radical, innovative, and highly idiosyncratic. His incorporation of found and readily available commercial materials is a perhaps more obvious but no less confrontational effort to reconsider and reorder what painting is. In the auto revision paintings of 1935, Miro seems to be synthesizing elements of many prior series into a new painting vocabulary. These works are marked first by a standard-sized cardboard, about 29 inches by 41 inches as the support. From that constrained starting point, though, he created works that are unconstrained in their materials, paints of varied medium, and found objects of all sorts mashed up together into a single work. Two personages, illustrated here, is a particularly aggressive example of this new synthesis. Miro working at what seems to be a fevered pitch in his continued revelations on the relations of painting practice. Although it is clear that he started painting with a multi-hued background, as he did in the 1933 paintings, the cardboard support, as well as the brushy application of the paint, results in a notably less atmospheric base. He then poured and dripped a darker paint over this background, further diminishing the kind of calmly colored backgrounds of early works. Miro continued to agitate the surface here as he applied textures of sand, tacks, and plaster, loops of paint and string, as well as painted figures. In doing so, he called upon a suite of materials he had already used, as well as introducing some new ones. In the lower left, so this detail is looking at this area of the painting. In the lower left, he makes a move we have seen several times before. He applied a white paint or plaster to create a rough texture that he then, however, covers with thin green paint here. Into this paint, the smooth, glossy quality of which suggested is rippling or some similar enamel, he has added a most aggressive texture, a spray of tacks. These tacks point not just literally at the crotch of the figure, but figuratively at yet another rejection of painting, as they are most likely tacks used to attach a canvas to a stretcher. Miro once again bringing a supporting player in traditional painting construction into the very center of the image. He has also returned to his use of string to draw lines, placing a loop string onto this already textured green passage. But here, too, he is leveling material distinctions and hierarchies, as further down in the lower left, he has poured a tan enamel paint in a series of loops, drawing immediate comparison in its color and shape to a string. Immediately adjacent, Miro has placed yet another familiar texture, sand adhered to the cardboard with the enamel paint, just as he had done with the tacks and string. This use of paint as adhesive, thus merely functional, and colorant rather than just colorant and thus aesthetic, is yet another reconfiguration of a painting material and its potential uses in making a work of art. Indeed, in the case of the tacks, which should be holding a painted canvas in place, the relationship is wholly reversed. They are being held in place by the paint. The final work I would like to discuss, I hope will bring us back to not just where Miro began, but also take us to where he believed himself to finish in his decade of depredations on and innovations to paint and paintings. Drawing collages from 1934. Collage works afforded Miro opportunities to incorporate found materials, novel subject matter, and varied textures into his art. His choices in drawing collage may have been driven by something else, a fairly direct rumination on painting. A photo from Miro's studio in the 1950s suggests the context for this composition, showing tubes of paint, an artist's palette, a stable of brushes, a rag for cleaning the palette and canvas, a vial of diluent, and ceramic dishes for the diluent, all laid out on a thick piece of paper tacked to the artist's workbench. Turning to the collage, in the right center area is a white piece of paper tacked to the board support. Within this area of paper, also attached to the underlying board, are two cardboard tubes that display labels for Rembrandt artist's paint. So here are those illustrations. And you can see the Rembrandt label just peeking out from under there. Directly above these cardboard tubes for paint tubes is a circle of metal, perhaps a lid from something, which can be read as a reference to the diluent cup of the photo. And the L-shaped corrugated cardboard on the left is notched in the lower right corner, much like the artist's palette in the photo. It is believed that this work was given as a gift to Miro's art supplier, Lucien Lefebvre, so it is not surprising that he might have chosen such a direct meditation on painting for its subject. But it may also be that the work serves other, more subversive purposes for the artist as well. Its composition is, in this reading, a still life of the pictorial arts. Miro's professed admiration for the Dutch masters who possessed, in his word, magic, would almost certainly have led him to look at their many works of similar subject matter. Yet ultimately, he once again subverted the tradition in his homage to it. The palette of these humble materials, a drab brown for the most part, contrasts sharply with the high key of so many Dutch still lifes. And by consciously making a work out of materials that would change and degrade more readily than those of a painting, Miro may well have been injecting a kind of vanitas into the work, suggesting that it is not just the life of man that is short, but the life of painting as well. In his effort to assassinate painting, Miro engaged the traditions of painting on many fronts during the years from 1927 to 37, confronting them with works that employ the nuanced alteration of traditional practice, as well as the full-throated rejection of it. His materials were those of the high Renaissance, as well as those of the local painter-carpenter. He drew and painted, he glued and hammered, he cut and pasted. He took the materials of painting that he and others had used for many years already and re-examined them, invented new uses for them, and reordered their relationship to each other. Despite this defiance and even defiling of painting and its traditions, the assassin himself poignantly observed many years later, "What can I say? I can't be anything other than a painter." Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for this wonderful presentation on anti-painting and assassination of painting, from things the way go to a combination of materials and the burning passion of Miro for all possible ways of exploration. We do have some time for questions. Do we have any question for Jim?
Christine.
What happened with the earlier part of your talk? Did he say he was going to assassinate?
He did, yes, yeah. Pretty provocative word to use.
Were there any experiments that you know that, like, 40 years later fell apart, like didn't work?
No,
Didn't hear, didn't, pass that over, fix it in over?
well, some discoloration, things like that, but I don't think any have turned to dust yet. Yeah. Frank?
Yeah, so those earlier ones, the unprimed canvas,
Yeah.
where you have the staining from the sizing.
Yeah.
Is that something you would have welcomed, do you think, that kind of alteration of the shape of the stretcher ghosting through?
Yes, specifically the ghosting of the stretcher. Not only did he do it, am I fairly certain he welcomed it, he actually, a few years earlier, some of these stretcher bar marks had begun to peek through, and he had left them in place. Then there is one picture, the title of which I forget, where he actually just took the trouble to add them. So he very much wanted that, I think, yeah.
I mean, it seemed like you really understood materials.
Oh,
You had to have that.
yeah. Yes, I hope I demonstrated that he did have that knowledge, and that was the base from which he could interrogate it in all the different ways that he did. And I will tell you that he would have been one hell of a conservator. His brush was as steady as any you can imagine.
And the fact that he used the size
Yeah,
was,
yes,
showed that he knew what was important.
yep, yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Jim. Is your sense that this was experimentation for the sake of rule breaking, for the experimental possibilities in itself, or do you think that Miro was working his way towards finding the kind of effects that would work best for the expression of his ideas? Another way to ask that is, like, does this experimentation settle down after a certain point, and where does he kind of end up?
I think this is a period when he is doing a great deal more questioning of, as I hope my title suggested, what to paint means and what a painting is. And because there are many years when he does not paint much at all. He delves into ceramics. His interest in all kinds of materials and how to utilize them, I guess, is manifested quite clearly here within a somewhat more narrow context in the broad universe of materials that over the course of his life he uses. But yeah. Ken?
When you mentioned him using tempera and that you thought he made his own, I may have missed this, but why do you think he used his made his own rather than buying a commercial tempera?
I just don't think that he would have had gone to the. I think that his interest in the material would have required him to do that, and that. And I honestly don't know how broadly available an egg tempera would have been on a commercial basis at that time.
Yeah, part of why I'm asking is because around that time, tempera was becoming very popular and
Yeah.
commercial formulations were coming
Yeah.
on the market that may or may, well,
Yeah.
were or were not egg. There was all sorts of
Yeah.
formulations being sold
Yeah,
as
yeah, yeah. And your point is well taken. My evidence for them being egg tempera is the label. I've not seen any testing to prove that they were not. If indeed it's a commercial one, I'll take that out of the argument. Yeah.
So thank you so much for this talk and for all of these really clear examples of both Murrow's playing through a tradition and breaking the tradition. And I was really fascinated by the range of those examples from everything from the kind of order of like what is being made on top of what, and like these examples of the gesso and the structural support. And I think my question is, to go back to this question of the assassination of painting, what would have looked like an assassination of painting to viewers, and what might have been a kind of set of procedures that would have registered as an assassination of painting only to like other painters or to himself? Like, how much do you think of sort of like what we're tracking through the materials would have been part of the reception of the works?
Without a doubt, his primary audience, in my mind, was other artists. It was Breton, it was Surrealist. Picasso paid great attention to this, and as he was, of course, paying great attention to Picasso. And I think that, this kind of argument that I'm making is one that I don't think the average viewer without knowledge of studio practice would understand. They would see these crazy things of wood on wire mesh. Shall we skip this version or remind me later? I think that would have been their front. But I think for the most part, such a thing as the wire mesh and wood sculpture would be viewed as a sculpture, and less so a meditation or a front to painting. And I'm willing to countenance the possibility that say, really, you think that has anything to do with painting? But it seems to me. Yeah, in the back.
I was really curious about the way that the 27 paintings on raw canvas had changed over time, and sort of the way in which we might, that might register as the way that Miro was thinking about these paintings working, not only as assassination of painting, but in time and changing sort of through history. But that made me really curious about the reproduction of the Spanish dancer and the differences between
Yeah.
sort of the more present art contemporary reproduction of that and the kind of line in the challenge painting. So I wonder if you thought at all about the difference between the two white paint. It just looks so.
The white paint in which,
On the, was it sandpaper?
Yeah,
The Spanish
yeah,
dancer, it
yeah.
looks so different between the two paintings, and I was wondering,
oh,
reproduction, I'm sorry.
Yeah, did he alter the paint between when it was illustrated in Aragon and the way it looks now? I don't believe he did, no. I think all the features of that remain in place, with the exception of that one. And I'm really confused. To the best of my knowledge, and this is anecdotal from curators, Miro was okay with the insertion of that nail into the support. Whether he participated in that or whether it happened in the hands of some owner, I don't know, but that he did see the work afterwards, and fine with him. But other change, I'm just not I don't believe occurred in that.
I get the feeling that color change would not have been detrimental to this.
Yeah, and in regards to any perceived changes that might have occurred in those 27 paintings, I think that they would they'd be fairly minor and simply amplifying elements of the composition that were already there, and thus just more of Miro in a sense.
Question, some of the things that you showed echoed some things that we've seen in our work on the Collage with typical canvas, but also I was personally surprised to see that sometimes in the background, Collage used basically brown material, white material, and paint to create visual differences, and I wonder how much in that example that you brought, you think there was an intention of sort of making a painting naked and sort of showing the interior of it
Yes.
by using the ground
Yeah.
as opposed to also the mat and sort of
Yeah.
more grand around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So since you mentioned the word sculpture, I feel a little bit more at liberty to ask. How do you think that this freestanding sculpture, maybe even his painted freestanding sculpture, fits in at all to his assassination of painting? Or was it something entirely separate?
Well, I and I think art historians have generally bracketed his assassination of painting within this decade of 27 to 37. And there are some freestanding sculptures during that period. Small, they're quite small. They didn't find their way into the lecture, so I guess they don't seem to address this question in my mind. Yeah.
No more questions? Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was really stimulating for so many reasons and very thought-provoking and could lead to a lot of different kinds of directions and discussion. We designed this series to be very focused on scholarly exchange and interdisciplinary conversation, and everyone in this room could be a fantastic participant in that regard, and I think that we have a lot of things that we can discuss using this as a springboard and maybe getting a little bit more in-depth or a little bit more expansive. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute break, and I invite everyone to have some more coffee and some more sugar because that will get us charged up.